2 decades. That's about as long as I've been actively conscious. I'm 26 now, but it was only around when I was 5 or 6 that I really recall ever having any actual agency, you know? That point in your childhood where you wake up like a sleeper agent and discover free will. Yeah, my entire living memory, and maybe yours too if you're a similar age. Could you imagine committing all of that time just to help restore and preserve someone else's work? A work that had been through so much already it practically screamed for the world to let it go. Well, in 1978, one woman refused to let it go. Art scholar Penimbrambilla Barcelon started what would become a 21-year restoration project of Leonardo da Vinci's mural, The Last Supper. An entire career's worth of time, the pinnacle of what she was able to achieve, was all devoted to history, to restoration. She was faced with the project of a lifetime, something that admittedly would drive me absolutely insane. But even so, she took that battlefield of a mural head on. A mural that was painted in the late 15th century and for the 500 or so years before it got to her, suffered a blatant disregard for the art piece itself, World War II bombings that destroyed most of the monastery the work was painted in, and many well-meaning restoration attempts that only made things worse. By the time Barcelona was staring it down, Da Vinci's work was already buried under 19 previous restoration attempts. Centuries of paint, varnish, wax, and plaster were caked on, to the point you'd even start to wonder if there was any of the original left. But there was. Barcelona spent those 2 decades in front of a 9-meter wide wall begging to be saved, with a scalpel in hand, lifting off centuries of damage while restoring and preserving the original work by only a few millimeters at a time. It may not be the painting it once was when it was made in the 15th century, but it had far more work put into it by her than Da Vinci himself ever even did, and now sits perfectly preserved in a climate-controlled room built around the wall it was originally painted on. The mural that refused to die. That's a bit of a weird thing to say though, isn't it? Because things are never truly alive. I mean, metaphorically, sure. When you rebuild a car and start the engine for the very first time, you might say something like, it's alive. It even feels very much alive, but at the end of the day, these are just things. Things that, ironically enough, do have their very own life expectancies. So even with that in mind, knowing full well it's near impossible to have something live forever, why do we put so much of our actual life, so much of our limited time and energy into restoring and preserving things? Well, let's start by separating those two ideas. Preservation and restoration. We're going to talk about both a lot in this video, so it's worth making the distinction up front. Preservation is important and serves its purpose, but let's be real, it is kind of boring. Kind of like those billionaires that buy hypercars and immediately put them into storage, hoping to profit off keeping a well-preserved example in a couple of decades from now. Preservation also includes slowing down the aging process of things that have already started to decay. Think fine art, architecture, old film media, watches. To be honest, you can almost attempt to preserve pretty much anything. But whether people actually do it or if it's even worth doing is something we'll talk about very soon. So what happens when something's decayed a little bit too much and we desperately want to bring it back? We find any way we can, even if it takes 20 years to restore it. Restoration is like preservation's cooler older brother, because you get to bring something that very well could have been literally dead in the water back to its former glory. Hell, it might be controversial to some, but you could even change or maybe even exceed this thing's former glory if you really wanted to. Plus, once you've restored something, not only do you get the sense of accomplishment, you can also continue to preserve that thing from then on out. Win-win. It's also a much funner process to watch and something far more satisfying to see happen than just simple preservation. Sure, seeing well-preserved art in a museum is really cool, there is something special about that, but seeing guys like Varish and Matt Armstrong completely restore hypercars and document the entire process for our viewing is just priceless. We really are simple creatures at the end of the day. Seeing something get a second chance at life clearly tickles a little something in all of our brains. Because if it didn't, all that type of content wouldn't be so damn popular. But again, why? Why are we like this? Is it because our own lives are finite? Is that why we want to build and restore things that can outlive us? And how do we even choose what gets a second chance and what gets to be preserved and live far long after we're gone? I guess a good way to start would be by figuring out when we actually start to care about the longevity of a thing. And to figure that out, we need to consider three things. 1, how important the thing originally was. 2, how long it's been since it was new. And the third really starts to complicate things, so we'll actually get back to that in a minute. But with just these two things in mind, we can actually start to map out a graph that shows you exactly what I'm trying to say. The Last Supper was pretty damn important and influential at the time it was created, so it sits right up at about here. Then over decades it would degrade, lose some of its importance, shown in the lack of care in preserving it. But attempts were still made, so it still never truly bottomed out. Then over centuries, the sheer amazement at it still even existing, paired with how incredible it even was for the time it was made, completely overshadows its original significance back here of the commission piece it originally was. So it continues to rise all the way up here until the late 20th century when it was inevitably restored. But this is one extremely significant piece of art. What about something still iconic, maybe not quite as much, but also mass-produced? Like, I don't know, an R32 GTR? Well, it actually follows a very similar trajectory. It doesn't sit quite as high, but it was very influential in motorsport, being the GTR that earned the name Godzilla. Then, over the years, the 33 came, the 34 would come after that. And then by the early 2000s, a decade or so after the R32 was new, the care factor for it hit all-time lows. While yes, GTRs as a whole were very popular JDM picks and seen in all types of pop culture and media like the Fast and the Furious movies, they were still relatively common to come across in Australia due to us being so close to Japan, so we'd get many Japanese imports. This made them cheap as chips here, and at their lowest point you could get them for around 15,000 Australian dollars, or bottoming out at about 10k USD. And at that price, a lot of people wouldn't consider them a future classic or something they'd want to preserve for the next 20 years. So what they'd do is fuck around and play with them now. I was browsing forums from as late as 2010 when people were still debating whether or not R32 GTRs would appreciate in value. And a surprising amount of people said no, because at the time, there were a couple of relatively mid examples struggling to sell for the 25k AUD mark. So you'd see comments like, they're a 20-year-old car, there's no way they're going up from here.
Are you sure?
You can't compare them to Aussie muscle cars like Monaros, they just don't carry that prestige in this country. There's so much supply and no demand for these things. And while some of this might have been kinda true in 2010, there was one guy with the username Nismo that said it better than anyone else. Anyone who thinks they won't rise in value is kidding themselves. Some 18-year-old fanboys will eventually become middle-aged men who can afford a toy. Which leads me perfectly into the third secret point I was hiding earlier that complicates things. How old you are. Most things worth preserving follow a pretty traditional J-curve like we've seen so far, where they start with some inherent value, lose a bunch of it at the start due to depreciation or just plain ignorance, and then slowly lose more and more value over the years until it hits the bottom of its depreciation curve, when no one really cares about it anymore. Then gets rediscovered, and before you know it, sharply rises in value way past where it originally started. Unless it doesn't. There are some cars that start to flatline or even just completely bottom out and never come back up. Or others that see a rise, flatline, and then come back down. This happens when a thing just isn't quite iconic enough and starts to get so old that everyone who did care about them and would have spent money to buy, restore, and or preserve that thing are just long gone. This is why the first point, how important a thing was when it first came out, is so important. And how the second point, how old it is, can correlate directly with how old you are. Because how important something is seen as today is also determined by the people of today. And I say it can correlate because it's also heavily dependent on what we're talking about. Fine art like The Last Supper will continue to age and continue to stay relevant and important for years to come. Maybe not important to you in particular, but that doesn't really matter. It's one art piece, it's beyond iconic, it's already far past the point of only really being remembered by those who were around when it was created, and it's already preserved in a climate-controlled room with limited visitor access and light exposure. It is one significant piece of art history that will continue to be preserved by the Italian government, likely for another 500 years and beyond. Now, how about the average R32 GTR? What will it have after 500 years? I mean, sure, a few might be preserved in museums. They were somewhat notable in the grand scheme of things, but they definitely won't be as sought after and appreciated as they are right now. They'll likely still become more valuable in the future because of how rare they'll become, but they won't really gain any value by being sought after. Right now, we've got a lot of people with a lot of nostalgia and fond memories of the late 90s to early 2000s. People like myself, who would absolutely love to own a piece of motorsport history that is a Nissan Skyline GTR. We saw it on posters, in video games, in real life races, and in movies. So let's take a step back and say, even in as soon as 100 years, in 2125, will there be many people left alive that remember that history and even care about an old Nissan? They won't have grown up with all this exposure to it. They'll have a completely different thing to care about. So will they care? Yes, I'm sure there'll always be one guy, some Jay Leno with a future, that'll be determined to keep these things around, but can you even name a single car from 100 years ago without looking it up? There are cars that were the pinnacle of automotive engineering in 1925. Can you name a single one of them? I can't, and I'm not going to, just to illustrate my point even further. Because yeah, while it would be cool to see a car from 1925 preserved and driving around today, I honestly don't really care too much about it. If an article was published that said the last, Ford from 1925 was just burnt in a museum or something, most people of today wouldn't even click on it, let alone care. But if somehow every single R32 GTR on the face of the planet was gathered up by Elon Musk and burnt in some mass EV promotion so that none of them existed anymore, there are a lot of people who would be very angry and care. It would feel like a piece of history, a piece of our childhood was just blown up in smoke. There aren't really many people around that have that kind of same attachment to a car built in 1925. So by 2125, it'll likely be the same for an R32 GTR. There won't really be many people that care anymore. Which is also why I so heavily preach to drive your damn cars. Keep them maintained, sure, but don't feel like you need to be so precious that you have to try and maintain the thing to last the next 100 years. Because really, how far back does your care factor even go? Just for cars in particular, we'll talk about other things later. My personal care factor goes back to the 60s at the latest. Cars like the Miura, Stingray, and E-Type are really cool. Then my care factor band, we'll call it, goes from the 60s till probably still right about now. There are some really cool cars still in production today that I think would be worth preserving for a little while and keeping around. The height of my care factor sits right in the nostalgia zone, which for me is the 90s to early 2000s. Cars in this era are ones I would hold in a much higher regard, just on a personal level. These are cars I would want to see restored and preserved, and even obviously like to own at some point one day. Now, if you're older than I am, your care band might start to look very different. Maybe it goes back to the 40s and extends to today, with it peaking in the 70s. Someone like Doug DeMuro, who grew up with a poster of a Countach on his wall, is far more likely to appreciate that car than I ever would. I do still have an appreciation for the Countach, it's within my care band, and I happen to learn a lot about it from one really cool manga I read. But it definitely doesn't sit anywhere near my peak. I have no real nostalgia for that car. Nonetheless, unlike a lot of other mainstream cars from, for example, the 70s that'll be long forgotten, the Countach was very special. It had a super high initial importance and will likely always be regarded as iconic in some way. So many of them will likely continue to be preserved for years to come. Same goes for many other exotic cars you might have heard of, old and new. The Ferrari F40, McLaren F1, Lamborghini Murcielago, Bugatti Chiron, Pagani Zonda, the list just goes on and on. Those were all ludicrous from the get-go and are iconic enough to be kept around. But if something isn't insanely valuable from the get-go, does that suddenly make it not worth restoring or preserving in the future? Well, no, it does make it far less likely, sure. You aren't going to see or watch a Matt Armstrong Toyota Camry restoration video, but it doesn't rule it out completely though. There are so many layers to this, and a lot of it really does all come back to how old you are. We talked about the context of when you were born and the kind of era you grew up in shaping what you care about, but the actual age you are will have another drastic effect. Growing up, like a lot of kids, I always wanted the latest, newest, flashiest thing. Game Boy? Nah, chuck that in the bin. I want the new DS. Soccer ball I already had? Bro, just take a knife to it at this point. I need that new Jabulani, even if it's just a fucking rep ball. It doesn't matter what it was, the fact remained it wasn't cool to have outdated shit. But in the last few years, as I've approached my mid-20s, all I have craved is old shit. I daily drive a car that was built in 2008, and whether you'd like to hear it or not, that makes it legal drinking age next year. Unless, of course, you live in the United States, land of the free mile. And while there are some newer cars I would like to own, this was my choice and I plan on keeping it around for as long as I can. The only reason I'd sell it is if I had the opportunity to buy a handful of other cars that are around the same age, if not older. Cars like a 996 or 997 911, R33 or R32 GTR, or last but not least, an NSX. The wheels I've currently got on my car are two-piece Volk Racing GTNs built in 2000. I love these wheels. They're a perfect and rare spec that fit the guards of so many iconic JDM cars. They are literally my favorite marketplace pickup ever. They have existed for as long as I've been alive. And you know what? I might even keep them for the rest of my life. They are that cool. Maybe one day I'll even rebuild them into a 3-piece wheel with a step lip to 19 inches. They're just such a nice, timeless shape, and sure, there are many other wheels with a similar face design out there, but you don't see these wheels that often, and it really is one of those if you know kind of things. And plus, just the fact they've lasted from 2000 all the way up until now make them all the more special. Straying away from even cars at the moment, my wife and I are looking to move in the not so distant future. And we both agree that we really want to sell our modern, off-the-plan home we built back in 2021 to go out and find an older, more homey kind of home built in like the late 90s, early 2000s era. Yes, I know that wouldn't be considered an old house to a lot of people, but we're in Australia, alright? Our architectural history outside of major cities really isn't all that old for the most part. And to be honest, I don't want to deal with asbestos. We just want some of the luxuries of a modern home with a lot more of the character and fun design choices of a pre-millennial grey built home. But even at this point, knowing that I keep looking back I still keep coming back to the question of why. Why do I and so many others do this to ourselves? From old cars, old wheels, old homes, old, I don't know, watches, old furniture, hell, the whole concept of thrift shopping in general. It's like we're all trapped in some crazy level of nostalgia. For me, it's almost like I want to shape the entire world around me as much as I own as what's practical to be like what I had growing up. So what's with this masochistic tendency to not want something that's brand new? Why do we put ourselves through the struggle of finding and dealing with things that are old and half the time more expensive than what's brand new? Why do we consider things that were standout in their time but are pretty outdated by today's standards so special? And why do we insist on keeping them around? Well, to put it simply, it's all just nostalgia and a touch of survivorship bias to boot. Nostalgia really is the invisible thread that just ties all of this together though. It's one of the strongest driving factors for why we would want to preserve or restore something. And it relates right back to my care band from earlier. Roughly every 20 to 30 years, you will witness a cultural cycle where a generation that grew up with a certain style, a certain thing, suddenly reaches their peak earning potential in the workforce, and then start to subtly dictate how the media and world around them start to look with their wallet and what they consume, which typically kinda is reminiscent of what they're nostalgic for. Millennial grey and minimalism was the trend from about a decade or so ago, and now mid-century modern and maximalism have once again entered the fray. Something I go into way more in my Minimalism is Dead video, which you definitely should go and check out. And now that you've clicked on my channel to go and find that video and save it to your watch later, why not just hit that subscribe button and maybe even like this video while you're at it. This is why you'll likely see, I have seen my analytics, so let's just say you'll more likely have your girlfriends or wives show you a lot of renovation or restoration TikToks and Reels that either A, show people restoring nice old mid-century modern furniture from the last time it was in fashion, like post-World War II, the late 80s revival of it, and the early 2000s, like when I grew up. Or B, you'll see people ripping up laminate floors to show beautiful tiles or natural wood floorboards underneath, only for that to then go out of fashion again, then someone in the 2040s to then cover it up, and someone in the 2060s to once again rediscover it. It's an endless cycle, but it is one that's far more rewarding when you are on the restoration side of things, rather than the destroying such a nice kitchen only to paint it white side of things. This again applies to cars. Your dad is going to have a very different care band and style to you. What's even more interesting though is that cars have started to have a long enough effective lifespan to start to see similar changes in culture to how houses have. A really clean car in the 90s could have become a riced out sex spec car in the early 2000s, then got restored to something more minimal in the late 2010s, only to start having some slightly crazier but more aesthetically pleasing, at least to today's standards, mods put on it once again in the 2020s. We didn't see this kind of shift quite as much previously because a lot of cars just never really made it that far. They'd become super unreliable to own and would only really be restored faithfully by extreme enthusiasts, which then brings us really neatly into the survivorship bias part. Most of the really old cars you see today will be nice, likely will have been restored, or have been and will continue to be for now preserved. And that's because you will only ever see the nice ones. You won't ever see the crap ones from back in the day because they just didn't cut it on my graph from earlier. They had no initial importance, and if they did maybe even have a little, it wasn't enough to keep them running and maintained as it became harder and harder over the years. Cars that had a high enough initial importance didn't need to be easily maintained to be well preserved. And cars with lower, but not complete bottom of the barrel importance, like, I don't know, a Toyota Camry that no one really cares about, that also somehow managed to keep running over the years, were given honorary levels of importance just based on how long they've managed to last. Because we assume that for it to still be here and running today, it had to have been pretty decent in the first place, right? And then we continue to assume that everything else from that era must have been equally well made. And that stuff these days just, it isn't built the same as it used to be. When in reality, it's just that one thing that happened to get kind of lucky. But yeah, mate, whatever you say. Those modern cars are just made out of paper. The old rigid frames and chrome bumpers are so much better. Crumple zones? Nah, get that out of here. Me personally, want to be the one that crumples when my unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Sorry, you just go into one comment section of a photo of an old car crashing into a new car and see all the comments in that, and you just, it makes you want to... Don't be mistaken though. This doesn't mean that things like planned obsolescence aren't real. There are truly a lot of things, including cars, that aren't built to last these days, but it's a bit different and we'll get to that later. So more than just the plain nostalgia, the survivorship bias is where we get this compounding effect, where if something reaches a certain age, it just becomes so impressive that it made it to that age in the first place that we assign more importance to it than it ever originally had. And because it's been around for so long, we want to continue to restore and preserve it for even longer. IKEA built an entire marketing campaign around this concept. They asked people to find the build date sticker on their old IKEA furniture, and the submission with the oldest date would receive, well, an IKEA gift card, but hey, at least it's something. The winning piece of that contest ended up being a 55-year-old coffee table, making everyone, for maybe just a moment, forget about the millions of bits of garbage IKEA furniture and make it feel like a brand that really could produce a product that might last generations. Okay, I hear what you're saying though, because none of this, not nostalgia or survivorship bias, account for why billionaires are buying up and preserving new modern hypercars right now, or why scum of the earth Pokemon TCG scalpers are running in flocks to Walmart's, Targets, whatever have you, to get their grubby little hands on as much sealed product as possible. Because it's not like you can be nostalgic for something new, you've never even experienced it yet. These acts of preservation fall more under the category of speculative investments, based off of other similar but older things that people are nostalgic for, were preserved well, and ended up gaining a lot of value. The McLaren F1 and P1 are extremely rare collector's pieces that will continue to gain in value going forward. They would both sit all the way up here on the importance graph, so it would just make sense to assume that the W1 will follow a very similar trajectory. And if you're rich enough, why not just buy it and preserve it for another decade or so? It'll probably make you a shit ton of money, and hey, who wants to drive their cars anyway? Yeah, I thought you might have that look of disgust written all over your face right now. What we've covered so far, iconic status, historical significance, nostalgia, and survivorship bias all start to help tell us when we start caring about something, and also answers the question of why we want to go out of our way to restore and preserve things. Great, video over, right? No, I'm not trapped in your screen, you are trapped in here with me. Because now we've got to answer one final extremely important question that rounds this whole thing off. When does it stop making sense to restore or preserve something? And to get that answer, we have to consider how difficult it is to restore or preserve, and the level of difficulty or inconvenience someone is willing to put up with directly relates to our graph from the beginning. Something that has a high initial importance, or even something that gains importance later in life, no matter how it gains it, will see its monetary value go up accordingly. And people suddenly become far more patient with things that are rare and expensive. Starting with preservation, cars themselves are on the difficult side of things. My mechanic once told me there is nothing worse for a car than to just let it sit. Rubbers go hard, seals dry out, leaks start, brakes seize, condensation can fuck your motor or your fuel tank. It's all just a big recipe for disaster. So to keep a car preserved, you need to keep on top of it. You need a good place to store it. You need to be running it every so often. And you need to be doing constant servicing, even if you're not putting any Ks on it. But it is worth it if the car is valuable enough. Just ask Jay Leno. Now, digital media. Think movies, shows, games, TV shows, music, anything of that nature are far easier to preserve these days by comparison. You just need digital storage and a person who cares enough to keep a copy so that it doesn't become lost media. Fine art would sit somewhere right in the middle of these two, so long as a piece is kept in a climate control environment that isn't exposed to harsh sunlight. It's likely to last a very long time without much additional effort, and won't really continue to degrade at the same rate a car would, so long as it has some value because it was painted by at least a somewhat prolific artist. Keeping an art piece around is a far easier pill to swallow. Restoration, on the other hand, starts to get far more complicated. Because while yes, it is extremely difficult to restore a flooded McLaren P1 or a burnt up 918 Spider, if you've got the money to do it, why the hell wouldn't you? Both are pieces of art on wheels that deserve to live again. They will still have a lot of value once restored, especially if you document the entire restoration and uploading it publicly on YouTube, showing that it was done properly with no cut corners. And on top of that, you can also generate revenue off each video, if you are a YouTuber that has an audience and gets high views, that is. So in that circumstance, the restoration even starts to pay for itself. But at the same time, it would also be extremely difficult to restore a flooded or burnt up Camry. But I mean, no one's gonna. The same way people are more forgiving when something is rare and expensive, most people are indifferent when something is cheap and common. If something has no real value, why restore it? Even if the effort to do so is pretty minimal. A written off Camry that just had some damaged fenders and maybe a bent control arm that could be back on the road with a couple of hours of labor is still less likely to be restored than a flooded or burnt hypercar. Because it's not valuable, it's suddenly considered consumable. So you might as well just buy a new one. And this right here, right now, is where planned obsolescence rears its ugly head. Some things are just made harder or even impossible to restore on purpose, which is a damn shame, and good old Lewis Rossman has some really strong opinions and words to say about that. So if you want to learn more about right to repair, definitely go check him out. But a very brief rundown of what I'm trying to convey here is when corporations that produce something, either A, intentionally design something to have a limited life, even though that thing doesn't necessarily have to have such a limited life, or B, make it exceedingly hard or even impossible to repair that thing, or all of the above. How this looks in practice is parts being discontinued for a thing before it even reaches the end of its expected lifespan, certain parts being sold as assemblies rather than individually, and said assemblies end up costing more than a whole new product itself, phones needing software updates to work with certain apps you might use every single day, but those same software updates purposefully slow down and throttle your phone so that you slowly get convinced to want to buy a new one. The list just goes on and on, but basically, most companies want to make it so that even if you wanted to restore their product, you just can't. Especially if it's not through them and their repair centers directly. Because if you could just restore something yourself, then they won't be getting a repeat customer buying another high margin product. And if the only reasonable solution is to buy a new thing every time your thing breaks, then you've basically got a glorified subscription service. You don't really own it. Whether you like it or not, anything that you own that can't be reasonably repaired is pretty much just a subscription. Your phone, roughly 4 years if you really push it and don't need it for work. Your fancy new Dyson vacuum cleaner, I don't know, a year or two at best. Your printer, use it 5 times and buying an entirely new printer is cheaper than replenishing the ink. Hell, my fucking DJI Ronin gimbal may as well just be $1,000 deadweight. With these nasty pieces of work, if the batteries, these fuckers right here, are left to decharge for even as little as a month, they notoriously just completely die and cannot be recharged from there. This shouldn't happen, but because of their intelligent battery design, they just do. It's like some safeguard that's supposed to put it in a hibernation mode, but it's just a mode that you can't get it out of. You can even see that I have two here because I purchased a replacement battery a couple of years ago now, and it was one that I was really trying to keep on top of until I had an overseas trip to Japan. Spent a couple of weeks over there, and it was dead by the time I got home. I shouldn't need to ask someone if they can house sit my pets, my plants, and my DJI Ronin battery. To add insult to injury, DJI stopped selling these batteries like 2 years ago now. So even if I wanted to fork out another $150 I shouldn't need to fork out to buy an entirely new battery and get my Ronin working again, I just can't. I also want to make clear that it is obvious you can't expect a company to support a product indefinitely. There comes a point where, yes, something has reached the end of its lifespan and there will no longer be parts available. Think of things like GTRs. They are so expensive and hard to find parts for because they have been long discontinued for over 20 years now. Unless, when every now and then Nissan does reissue parts like they occasionally do with the Nismo stuff. But even then, it only happens in limited quantities because it's not really that profitable for them to do. And then the parts still just remain super expensive because at the end of the day, it's a 20-plus-year-old Nissan. This is where aftermarket parts fill the gap. But aftermarket parts are only ever made if, again, there are people around that care. The less people care, the more bespoke a solution needs to be. The more bespoke a solution is, the more expensive it is. And if no one cares, well, no one's going to get the expensive bespoke solution and restore the thing. When demand dwindles, obviously supply follows suit. Supply and demand doesn't apply as much to easier things to maintain because, well, there literally aren't as many moving parts. But just because something's discontinued, that doesn't necessarily contribute to planned obsolescence. These are different things. This is more like an example of a vacuum cleaner breaking within like a year, even though its expected lifespan should be far more than a year. And for example, said vacuum manufacturer is still selling that exact same vacuum, but making the parts and schematics and ways to repair it completely unavailable to consumers. It also would not surprise me if many electric cars suffer the exact same fate in a few decades from now. But I mean, fuck it. That's the next guy's problem, right? What this all boils down to is with the amount of things that are made to be disposable these days, it almost inherently makes things that can be restored and preserved that much more valuable. Isn't it crazy? Just having the ability to be able to fix something then adds more value to it, when it really should just be a given. So yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the time with a lot of things, it suddenly doesn't make much sense to preserve or restore them. But other times, it isn't even about the money. Just because something isn't valuable monetarily to someone else doesn't mean it isn't valuable to you. Maybe it's your grandfather's watch that has been in the family for generations. Maybe it's your childhood home that would make more sense to demolish and rebuild than restore. Or maybe it's just an old car that you feel some kind of way about. We all really are just massive suckers for nostalgia at the end of the day. So much so that when you have something that already has been preserved or restored before, or something that has good bones and looks like it can be restored, it can start to feel like you've got some sort of duty to keep that thing around, which is kind of cool in and of itself, isn't it? And sometimes it goes even further beyond nostalgia. Sometimes it's simply just about the principle. This thing should last longer than it has. I don't want to chuck it out and go and buy a new one, so I'm just gonna fix it. Kind of like this guy and his washing basket. It's such a simple thing, and funnily enough, my washing basket also has the same problem, but he's not giving in to overconsumption. He's just using stuff he has around the house to fix a thing he has so he can use it that much longer, even though it would have been so much easier to go to the store and spend like a couple of bucks on a new plastic wash basket. But all right, what about things that don't necessarily need to be preserved or restored? Sometimes it stops making sense to keep something as pristine as possible, because there is a beauty in things that have aged. And there are certain things that get better with a bit of age and wear. A new cast iron is pretty shit until it gets well seasoned. Real well-made leather boots need to be worn in before they get nice and comfortable. And as they start to age, they develop this really nice patina. Quality denim has to be broken in a little as well and has this perfect golden window where it just fits so nicely. Before, yeah, it'll eventually start to wear thin and become beyond repair. But even then, it'll last far longer than anything you could ever purchase from the likes of H&M. The point I'm trying to make is, while it is good to try and make things last, and wherever possible, we really should try to do it, not everything is built to last forever. And even when it comes to well-made stuff, even then, not everything can last forever. There comes a time with a lot of things where you will eventually have to let go. And this is the part where I start to get a little bit personal. My videos have always been a reflection of myself. Kind of like a personal diary that I try to keep somewhat entertaining for you guys, right? My initial D, One Gun Midnight, and How a Car Can Change Your Life videos all came from me getting back into cars after years of just kind of putting them on the back burner so I can get ahead in life. The minimalism video was about how this year's trip to Japan changed my perspective. The AI video came out of frustration. The first car video came from my pop selling his car. And this video came from Harry. It wasn't intentional or anything at first, but when I do look back at it, it was around the same time we started to notice our cat Harry getting a little bit sick that I started writing this video. At the time, I didn't think we were going to lose him, and it's painfully ironic that unfortunately we did before I even got to finish this. Our boy passed away on the 15th of August 2025 in the comfort of his own home with both of us there with him. There's nothing my wife and I would have wanted more than a few years, months, weeks, days, even hours to spend with him. But it was time to say goodbye. And it's just another one of those crushing moments that really puts things into perspective. Because if there's one thing we can't preserve or restore indefinitely, it's life. We can make every effort possible to live the best life we can, so that we can live as long as we can in as healthy of a state as we can. But sometimes shit just happens. That doesn't mean it's futile though. You should still try to preserve or restore anything you have control over. The emotions you feel, the sense of accomplishment and pride, those are very real. But just don't forget to actually live in the moment and make the most of the limited time you have, rather than simply clinging on the past. Nostalgia feels good, but it's the memories you make today that create the nostalgia of tomorrow. You can still take care of things without being overly protective and precious of them. So drive that car, crease those shoes, snap those book spines, play a game with those overly expensive trading cards, use that house you live in, make it a home. It doesn't have to be a display home. And even when the entirety of capitalism and the design of consumer goods are all just stacked up against you, I hope that you continue to restore or preserve things as long as you can, big or small, because the less time we just get a new one, the better. And for everything else that you can't preserve or restore, just be sure to spend more time with them, because you'll never know when the day comes that you can't have them back. So yeah, this one's for Harry. Thanks for watching.